I want you to hold an image in your mind, just for a second. It's an image you've definitely seen, probably 1,000 times.
Oh, yeah. You see it in every history book, every documentary.
Exactly. It's that image of absolute, unwavering authority. The man of steel, the great comforter, the infallible architect of a civilization that was supposed to last 1,000 years.
1,000-year Reich.
Right. And you're probably picturing someone huge, right? Physically imposing, stoic, maybe even a little bit terrifying in just how perfect they seem.
That's certainly the image they wanted you to see, the projected image. The Übermensch, the superior man who was completely beyond any human frailty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, I want you to just shatter that image. I'm going to read you a description, and this comes from a secret intelligence file from 1943.
So, written right in the middle of the war.
In the thick of it. And it's describing the exact same man, but it talks about a very ladylike walk. It describes dainty little steps. It mentions, and I'm quoting here, flabby muscles, bad teeth, a hollow chest, and a face that looks cartilaginous, like it doesn't even have bones.
Wow, cartilaginous. That's a strangely specific insult.
Isn't it? The file calls him a provincial dandy and a caricature of a man.
It is an incredibly jarring contrast. I mean, it really feels like we're talking about two completely different people, two different species even.
And yet both of those descriptions, they refer to the same person, Adolf Hitler. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today our mission is to peel back the curtain on one of history's most carefully, most meticulously constructed myths. And we're not looking at the history books that were written 50 years later.
No, this is primary source material. We're looking at what people were seeing and analyzing at the time.
We are. And we're doing it through the lens of two incredible and very different sets of historical documents.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating mix of materials today that I think cover the whole spectrum of perception. On one hand, you have the external projection.
What they wanted the world to see.
Exactly. It's a visual analysis of a 1942 Nazi propaganda film about their winter relief fund. And then on the other hand, you have the internal reality.
Or at least the reality as the Allies were trying to understand it.
Right. A massive, formerly secret psychological profile that was put together by the OSS, that's the Office of Strategic Services, which was, the precursor to the CIA.
And this OSS report, it was written by a psychoanalyst named Walter C. Langer. And it is absolute wild. The title is A Psychological Analysis of Adolf Hitler, His Life and Legend.
And you have to remember the context. This was not written for the public. This wasn't for entertainment.
No.
It was written for the Allied command right in the heat of the war to answer a very specific, very urgent question.
It was.
Who is this guy, really? How did a man that our own experts are describing as a provincial dandy, a caricature, how did this person manage to project the image of a messiah?
And not just project it, but how did the entire machinery of the state work to enforce that image?
That is the absolute core question of this deep dive. It's a study in the massive gap between reality and perception. And the OSS, they weren't just trying to insult him.
No, this was a weapon.
It was. They were trying to find the cracks in the armor. They desperately needed to know his psychological triggers so they could build effective counter-propaganda.
And they built this profile by relying on informants who knew him intimately.
People who had fled Germany, former associates, people who saw him up close before the myth-making machine went into overdrive.
The details they found are just bizarre. We are going to be talking about Disney-style cartoons being used for Nazi propaganda.
Which is a strange thought.
It's so strange.
Yeah.
And a leader who literally described himself as a sleepwalker, leading his country on pure instinct. We're also going to look at a charity system that was actually, when you look closer, a weapon of public terror.
It sounds completely contradictory, doesn't it? But when you start to assemble all of these pieces, a really terrifyingly cohesive picture of manipulation begins to form.
So let's start with the stage. I think before we can even begin to dissect the man, we have to understand the environment he built around himself and his people.
You really do. You can't understand the myth without understanding the theater it was performed in.
The source material we're looking at spends a lot of time on this one concept, a German word, Gleichschaltung. Now, for anyone listening who hasn't, brushed up on their German history lately, how do we unpack that term? It sounds technical.
It does, Gleichschaltung. It's often translated as coordination or maybe synchronization, but those words, they're just too soft. They sound like corporate buzzwords,
Like something from a business meeting. Let's synchronize our efforts.
Exactly. But in the context of Germany in 1933, it meant the total, all-encompassing, totalitarian wiring of society. When the regime took power, they didn't just take over the government buildings.
Right.
They took over the chess clubs. They took over the sports leagues, the choirs. I mean, every single aspect of what used to be private life was coordinated to align with the party's goals.
So there was basically no opting out. You couldn't just say, look, I'm not into politics. I just want to play soccer on Saturdays with my friends.
Precisely. Because if you played soccer, you played in a Nazi-approved league. If you sang in a choir, you sang Nazi-approved songs. Everything, and I mean everything, became political.
Yeah.
And a massive part of this coordination was about redefining the very concept of charity.
How so?
Well, in a free society, charity is a private act, isn't it? You give money or time because you feel empathy, or maybe a religious duty.
Sure, it's a personal choice.
Under Gleichschaltung, that choice was removed.
Yeah.
Charity became a state-controlled, mandatory demonstration of your participation in the Volksgemeinschaft.
The national community.
The national community. It wasn't about helping people anymore. It was about proving you were a good German.
And that brings us directly to our first source, this analysis of the propaganda around the Winter Relief Fund, the Winterhilfswerk. On paper, the slogan sounds so positive, so universal. No one should go hungry or freeze.
It ran every single winter from 1933 right up to 1945. And you're right, who could possibly argue with that sentiment?
Nobody. It seems completely benevolent.
Ideally, yes. The campaign was meant to provide food, clothing, coal, basic necessities during the harsh German winters. But the source material, especially that 1942 propaganda film analysis, shows us how it was weaponized.
So it wasn't really about helping the poor.
It was about proving your loyalty. It was a test administered to the entire population every single winter.
I was looking at the notes on this film, and the visuals they describe are just surreal. It's a film celebrating 10 years of this fun, and you see the expected stuff, Hitler making a donation, people happily volunteering.
All very polished and clean.
Very. But then there's this one detail that just stopped me in my tracks. The source notes the use of Disney-like animation.
It is a strange detail, isn't it? But you have to remember, the Nazis were, in a way, obsessed with American cultural power. They saw what Hollywood could do. They wanted to rival it.
So they're co-opting the aesthetic.
They are. So in this propaganda reel, you have these happy, fluid, bouncy cartoons. The source describes fish and livestock literally dancing around to visualize how much food has been collected. It's this incredibly cheerful, almost childish aesthetic, and it's overlaid on top of a brutal, totalitarian system.
That is so jarring. You have this regime built on violence and exclusion, and they're using happy cartoon fish to sell their success story.
It's a masterclass in emotional manipulation.
But the weirdest part for me, the part that really felt like a fever dream, was the Christmas ornament sequence.
Ah, yes, the Santa Claus.
Can you break this down for us?
Yeah.
Because the description in the source material it's just bizarre.
It really is. So the film shows a close-up of a Christmas ornament, a little Santa Claus, and it comes to life. It starts moving.
Okay, a little creepy, but I'm with you so far.
But then look at what happens next. Out of Santa's sack, you don't just see toys for good little children. You have little figures representing the charity's contributions marching out, little sacks of flour, little lumps of coal.
So they're literally putting the state's work into Santa's bag.
They're co-opting the entire symbol. And the source notes that this was a paradox, a real contradiction. The regime was at the same time trying to push Christianity aside.
Right. They were trying to redefine Christmas as this modern expression of pagan Germanic traditions, the winter solstice, all of that.
Exactly. They were trying to de-Christianize it, but they were still using Santa Claus.
Why?
Because it's pragmatic propaganda. They knew Santa Claus worked on an emotional level. He's a trusted, beloved symbol. So they just hijacked him for their own purposes.
It's pure cynicism.
It's total cynicism. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was very clear about the goal. And the source quotes him. He said, "The entire community will pay us allegiance when we come to the aid of the poorest."
Notice that word choice, not gratitude.
No, allegiance. This is a transaction. We give you coal, you give us your soul.
But the reality on the streets was very, very different from the happy cartoons and the marching toys.
Oh, completely.
The OSS source points out that while the film showed these smiling, happy volunteers, the German people had a nickname for them. They called them can rattlers.
Right. And you can just picture it. These weren't polite requests for a donation. These were uniformed collectors, often SA stormtroopers or party members, shaking these red collection tins right in your face.
It was aggressive.
It was incredibly aggressive. It was a public shaming ritual. If you didn't give, or if you didn't give enough, you weren't just being cheap. You were marking yourself as someone outside the national community. You were immediately suspicious.
There's a joke from a police officer cited in the source that I found so telling about the public mood. He said the quickest way to clear a crowd in a public square
Is to pretend to ask for donations.
Exactly. People would scatter.
Humor is often the only safe outlet for dissent in a totalitarian state, isn't it? It's a pressure valve.
There was another joke mentioned where the public remixed the slogan. So instead of, no one should go hungry or freeze,
They changed it to, no one has to go hungry without freezing too.
it's so dark. But
Yeah.
it perfectly captures that feeling of resentment. People felt squeezed, they felt coerced.
They were. And of course, the most sinister part of this whole charity was the exclusion. This help wasn't for everyone.
No, the source is very, very clear on this. Aid was only for Aryans in good standing.
So if you were a known political opponent, a socialist, a communist, or obviously if you were Jewish or from any other group deemed undesirable, you were simply removed from the beneficiary list.
The charity itself becomes a weapon of social sorting.
That's a perfect way to put it. It defined who belonged and who didn't. And it forced the population to pay for the exclusion of their own neighbors. You were funding a system that was starving the family down the street.
So this is the stage. This is the environment. You have a population that is being forced into conformity. They're being bombarded with this feel-good propaganda that masks a really threatening reality. And everyone is terrified of stepping out of line.
It is the perfect environment for a myth to take hold. It's fertile ground.
Absolutely. When people are that afraid and that confused, they crave a savior. They crave a figurehead who embodies the supposed success and strength of the nation.
And that brings us to the man himself.
Or, I guess, the two men. The man the public was shown, and the man that this secret OSS profile describes. Let's really dig into this physical description from the Langer report, because it's savage. They really, really went after him.
It's remarkably detailed. And again, we have to remember the methodology here. This isn't just gossip. The OSS used informants who knew Hitler personally.
People who saw him in the early days.
Exactly. Before the big PR machine took over, they were trying to strip away the aura to see the man underneath the uniform.
So let's start with the propaganda posters. We've all seen them. They show the man of steel, strong-jawed, determined eyes, a real military bearing.
The ideal Aryan warrior.
But the report just completely breaks down his physical reality. It says he was below average height with wide hips and, quote, relatively narrow shoulders.
And the muscles. The report uses the term flabby muscles.
Flabby muscles. That is not very ubermensch, is it?
Not at all. And the legs. The report describes them as short, thin, and spindly. It even notes that in the early days, he would try to hide them with heavy boots and later with very long trousers. He was apparently very self-conscious about his legs.
And his chest was described as hollow-chested. The report even mentions rumors that he actually had his uniforms padded in the shoulders and chest to look more imposing.
It's just classic stagecraft, isn't it? If you don't have the body of a warrior, you build a costume that suggests you do.
But the description of his early days, before he was chancellor, is even more surprising. Before the polished, stern image we all know, observers described him as a provincial dandy.
It's such a strange phrase.
When I hear dandy, I think of someone who is maybe overly fashionable, very put together, but the report suggests he was just bad at it.
A bad one, yes. A failed dandy. The report mentions he wore a cutaway coat, that he had slick dark hair that was pasted down with oil, and just generally awkward gestures.
There's a quote from a journalist, Edgar Mower, who saw him at his trial back in 1924. He described him as looking like a traveling salesman for a clothing firm.
Ouch. That's a deep cut.
It is. And the hygiene. The report flat out says his teeth were rotten and brown.
Yeah.
In those early days.
And the walk. This is a detail that really stuck out to the psychological profilers because it so dramatically contradicts the military march we associate with him.
What did they say?
They described it as a very ladylike walk, dainty little steps. And on top of that, he had this nervous addictic. He would constantly cock his right shoulder up and sort of snap his left leg as he walked.
So if you picture that, it's incredibly awkward. It's not a powerful stride.
It's the opposite of power. There's a quote from Dorothy Thompson. She was a famous American journalist who met him in the early 30s. And she called him formless, almost faceless, a caricature, a man without bones.
A man without bones. What a phrase. It's so evocative. It suggests this lack of substance, a kind of malleability, like he could just be molded into whatever the situation required.
Yeah. And, even his own supporters, or at least people you'd think would be on his side ideologically, saw this. Remember Professor Max von Gruber? He was a famous eugenist, a specialist in racial purity, ironically enough.
Right, he testified in court about Hitler's mental state after the beer hall push.
And he described Hitler's face and his head as belonging to an inferior type. His expert opinion was that Hitler had an expression of satisfied egotism.
That is just deeply, deeply ironic. The leading eugenist is calling the future leader of the master race an inferior type.
It really highlights the sheer brute power of the propaganda machine. I mean, think about the task Goebbels and his ministry had. They took this figure, this grotesque figure, as one observer called him, awkward, flabby, bad teeth, a weird walk, and they just erased him.
Ow.
They flooded the country with millions of posters. They had his teeth fixed. They padded the shoulders of his uniforms. They carefully, meticulously staged every single photograph.
They built an avatar, a brand. The public wasn't following Adolf Hitler the man.
No, they were following Adolf Hitler the product.
And the report notes that for most Germans, that physical reality was completely replaced by the image. The memory of the provincial dandy was just wiped clean, and all that was left was the man of steel.
A total fabrication, designed to cover up the fragile, insecure man underneath.
But it wasn't just about his look, was it? It was about his entire lifestyle. The OSS report goes into incredible detail about how he was marketed as an ascetic saint.
This was an absolutely crucial part of the myth. To be the Messiah, you have to be above human weakness. You have to be seen as pure.
So the propaganda machine portrayed him as extra human. No meat, no alcohol, no smoking.
And crucially, no sex. The narrative was that Germany was his bride. He couldn't be distracted by mortal, fleshy relationships. His entire life force was for the nation.
The report really digs into the why of this, though. The propaganda line was that he abstained from all this stuff to conserve his energy for the Reich. Like he was a battery, and he was saving up all his power.
They often compared him to the composer Richard Wagner, suggesting this sort of artistic, spiritual purity. But the report quotes Hitler himself, and he gives a much simpler and frankly more arrogant explanation.
What did he say?
He said, "Once I make up my mind not to do a thing, I just don't do it." Is that so wonderful?
So for him, it wasn't about virtue at all.
No, not in the slightest. It was about will. It was a demonstration of absolute control. I am not controlled by addiction or desire. I control myself. It's a subtle but really important difference. He wanted to show he was the master of his own biology.
The report also calls him the Great Comforter, this persona of kindness, and there are just endless stories of him with children and animals.
Oh, the press was absolutely full of it. Photos of him with what the report calls little tots.
Yeah.
Stories that his eyes would fill with tears when he was discussing children.
And the dogs. He famously loved his dogs.
Right. The report actually concedes that his affection for his dogs was probably genuine, but it also notes how even things like his vegetarianism were spun by writers. They'd claim it was because he had such empathy he couldn't tolerate the thought of animal slaughter.
Which is, it's just horrifying when you consider the industrial human slaughter he was actually responsible for.
It's the classic mask of the sociopath, the ability to project empathy while feeling none. The report cites this one story about a young peasant girl. She tries to approach him. His guards stop her. She starts to cry.
Right.
Hitler sees this. He intervenes, and he finds out that her fiancé was expelled from Austria for being a Nazi. And Hitler is supposedly so touched by this story that he finds the man a job and completely furnishes a flat for them.
It's a perfect fairy tale. It's the good king wandering among his people, solving their problems with a wave of his hand.
But the report contrasts this carefully managed public persona with the reality of his daily existence. The propaganda claimed he worked 16 to 18 hours a day, sacrificing every personal pleasure for the state.
But that wasn't true.
Not according to his inner circle. But the public believed it. There's a quote from a young Nazi in the source that is so revealing. He says, "I would die for Hitler, but I would not change places with him. He has no fun in life."
That is the tragedy of the follower, isn't it? They pity the leader for his incredible sacrifice, which only binds them closer to him. They feel indebted to his supposed misery.
And Hitler maintained this mystique by being a man of mystery. The report notes that he almost never talked about his personal past. He refused to divulge details. He created a blank slate.
So people could project whatever they wanted onto him.
Exactly. If you don't know where a man comes from, you can believe he came from heaven.
Or from Providence, as he was so fond of calling it. But let's talk about the one thing that even his enemies admitted was a real, undeniable talent. The voice.
The order.
The OSS report admits that despite the flabby muscles and the bad fashion and the weird walk, he was the greatest orator Germany has ever known.
Even his most bitter opponents had to concede this point. But the report clarifies something absolutely fascinating. It wasn't that his voice was pleasant.
No, the description is actually pretty gross. It says it was rasping and that it would break into a shrill falsetto when he got excited.
It also mentions his diction was bad, a mixture of High German and his native Austrian dialect. The source actually uses a German term for it. Nudlige Sprache.
What does that translate to?
Dumpling speech.
Dumpling speech.
As in, it sounds like he has hot dumplings in his mouth when he's talking.
So let me get this straight. He sounds like he's choking on dumplings and he's screaming in a high-pitched voice. How on earth did this mesmerize millions of people?
Because it was never just about the voice, it was the performance. The source breaks down the mechanics of a Hitler speech, and it was never just the speech, it was a full-blown theatrical production.
And it started with timing.
Always with timing. The report says he always scheduled his big speeches for late in the evening. Why do you think he did that?
I don't know. Better atmosphere.
To catch people when they were tired, the source calls it lowered resistance. When you've worked all day, your critical thinking faculties are duller. You're more open to emotional appeals, more susceptible to suggestion.
He didn't want an alert audience. He wanted an exhausted one.
That is manipulative genius, isn't it? And then came the entry. He didn't just walk out onto the stage.
No, he would march through the main aisle, from the very back of the hall, through the crowd. A band would be playing this lively, bombastic martial music. And the report says he would never glance left or right, just total focus straight ahead. It built this incredible sense of anticipation and then the warm-up. I found this part fascinating because you expect a demagogue to just come out screaming from the first word. But he didn't?
No, he usually started very nervously. The report describes him moving the table around on the podium, fumbling with his notes. He'd start slow, halting.
Why?
He was waiting. He was trying to get the feel of the audience. It's like a musician tuning an instrument before they play. He was looking for that psychic connection.
And once he found it?
The rhythm would smooth out. The tempo would increase. The volume would build and build. And the report describes the climax of his speeches as a purely physical exertion. He would be wilting his collar with sweat. His carefully pasted down hair would come unglued and fall over his face. His eyes would glaze over. One observer said he looked like a man hypnotized.
And the crowd mirrored that hypnosis.
The psychology of the crowd section in the Langer report is very, very telling. It describes a reciprocal relationship. He wasn't just talking at them. In a way, he was channeling them.
How so?
He would say the things they were secretly thinking but were too afraid or too ashamed to say out loud. He gave voice to their darkest fears and resentments. And when they cheered, it fed him, it validated him, which made him more extreme, which in turn made them cheer even louder.
It's a feedback loop of hysteria.
A feedback loop of pure, unadulterated hysteria. And you have to understand, Hitler viewed the crowd in a very specific and frankly deeply sexist way. He wrote in his book Mein Kampf, and the report quotes this, that the masses are feminine.
The masses are like a woman.
Yes. He truly believed that the crowd, like a woman in his view, doesn't want to be reasoned with. It craves a ruler, not a pleader. It wants to be dominated by a stronger force. So his speeches were designed to be a verbal act of dominance.
The report mentions women fainting in the aisles, people swaying back and forth with the rhythm of his voice, this palpable spiritual atmosphere.
It wasn't a political rally. For all intents and purposes, it was a religious revival.
Which leads us directly to the most dangerous part of this entire psychological profile. The Messiah complex.
This is where it goes from political ambition to something much, much darker.
This evolution is just terrifying. The report traces how he viewed himself over time, and it wasn't always godlike. In 1923, before the failed coup, he saw himself as the drummer.
Just the guy announcing the coming of a true savior, the herald.
But then came Landsberg prison. After the failure of the beer hall putsch, he's sitting in this comfortable prison cell, and his deputy, Rudolf Hess, starts calling him the Führer, the leader.
And Hitler began to believe it. He stopped looking for a savior and came to the conclusion that he was the savior Germany had been waiting for.
The report details his religious identification, but it's very specific. He didn't identify with the suffering Christ on the cross. That wasn't his style at all.
No, that was far too weak, too passive for him. He completely rejected the crucified Christ. He identified with the fighter Christ.
Specifically, the story from the Bible of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple with a whip.
That was his Christ, the Christ of righteous fury. There's a story from Ernst Hamstangl, one of his early associates who later fled, who reports seeing Hitler in a room, alone, actually swinging a leather whip violently through the air to demonstrate this point.
That's a chilling image. It's a glimpse into his violent fantasy life.
He saw himself as the scourger of the world, and people around him saw this delusion growing. Dietrich Eckart, another one of his early mentors, saw this happening and made a chillingly accurate prediction. He said, when a man gets to the point of identifying himself with Jesus Christ, then he is ripe for an insane asylum.
Eckart saw the madness coming, but the public bought it. And crucially, Hitler himself bought it completely. The report talks about his unshakable belief in his own infallibility. He just stopped listening to advice from anyone.
He famously called intellectuals and experts impudent rascals. He didn't need them. He relied entirely on his inner voice, on providence.
There's a metaphor he used that really gets to the heart of our deep dive today. After he occupied the Rhineland in 1936, which was a huge gamble that could have started the war years earlier, he was asked how he knew it would work. And he said, I follow my course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker.
Just think about that image for a second. A sleepwalker isn't looking at a map. They aren't weighing risks and benefits. They are moving on pure, unconscious instinct.
If you're the leader of a major nation, that is a terrifying thing to say out loud.
But he believed it because he thought he was divinely protected.
He even had receipts for this divine protection, didn't he? The report lists these stories he would tell over and over to prove he was chosen. The World War I trench story is the most famous one.
Yes. He claimed that he was sitting with his comrades eating dinner in a trench, and suddenly a voice in his head told him to move. Get up and go over there. He said he obeyed automatically without thinking. And moments later, a stray shell landed on the exact spot where he had been sitting, killing everyone.
And the Peswak hospital vision.
Right. He was temporarily blinded by mustard gas at the very end of World War I. And while lying in the hospital, convinced he would never see again, he claimed he had a vision where he resolved to liberate Germany. He believed God had saved his life and his sight for that specific purpose.
Now, a lot of people have heard the myth that Hitler was deeply into astrology. I've heard that my whole life. But the OSS report completely debunks that, doesn't it?
Completely. It says he actually banned fortune-telling and astrology in Germany. The report argues that he didn't believe the stars in the sky controlled his destiny. He believed the power was internal. It was his star.
So he didn't need an astrologer to tell him the future.
Because he had the inner voice. He had a direct line to providence.
Which is, when you think about it, even more dangerous. An astrologer might occasionally tell you, hey, bad day for an invasion. Mercury is in retrograde.
But an inner voice that thinks it's God never ever says stop.
Exactly. And this absolute conviction drove him to think, not just about the present war, but about eternity.
And that brings us to the final part of this deep dive. Immortality. The man was obsessed with time.
He was. The source mentions a conversation from 1935 where he was complaining that 10 valuable years were lost between his failed putsch in 23 and him finally taking power in 33. He was convinced he only needed 22 years to set everything right, and he was racing against his own mortality.
And he wanted to leave a mark that would last, quite literally forever. The report calls it his monumental complex.
He wasn't content with just being a transitory political leader. He wanted to set the pattern for all future generations. He said his Hitler highways, the Autobahn, must last longer than the roads built by Napoleon.
And speaking of Napoleon, the report mentions a visit Hitler made to Napoleon's tomb in Paris in 1940, right after he conquered France. And this moment really reveals his incredible ego.
It's such a telling moment. He goes to the Dôme des Invalides. He looks down at Napoleon's grand crypt, and his reaction isn't awe, it's critique.
He didn't like it.
He didn't. He said Napoleon was put down in a hole, and if you've ever been there, you know you have to lean over this balcony to look down at the sarcophagus. And Hitler said, and this is a direct quote, I shall never make such a mistake. I shall be the Führer they look up at.
Look up at. Even in death, he had to be in the dominant position.
So what was his plan?
He had his architect, Albert Speer, design a personal mausoleum that was to be 700 feet high. It was going to be the Mecca of Germany.
700 feet. That's the size of a modern skyscraper. A 60-story building, just for his body.
It would have been absolutely colossal. And his ultimate goal, as described in the source, was to swing the entire world into a long span of digestive process.
That is such a weird phrase. A digestive process? What on earth does that mean?
It means he wanted to do all the violent, active, chaotic shaping of the world during his lifetime. And then after his death, he wanted to leave behind a world that would just passively digest what he had done.
1,000 years of quiet inactivity.
Or people just sit around and admire the buildings he built and the world he created.
It's a vision of a dead world, really.
Yeah.
A world frozen in his image.
A tomb. He didn't just want a mausoleum for himself. He wanted the entire world to be his tomb.
So we've unpacked the sources. We've seen these two Hitlers. On one side, you have the secret reality. The flabby, nervous, formless man with the ladylike walk and the bad teeth. The man that the OSS knew about.
And then on the other side, you have the man of steel. The construct, the Messiah, the man who was created by those winter relief cartoons, by the carefully staged photos, and by those mesmerizing hypnotic speeches.
And the truly scary part is the connection between the two, isn't it? That reciprocal creation you mentioned earlier. The German audience wanted the Messiah so badly that they were willing to ignore the provincial dandy who was standing right there in front of them.
That really is the lesson for us today, I think. The myth wasn't just imposed from the top down in a very real way. It was pulled out of him by the crowd. They fed his delusion, and his delusion, in turn, fed their desperation.
It is a sobering thought. We like to think of dictators as these alien monsters who just hijack a country out of nowhere. But the sources we've looked at today suggest he was a mirror.
A horribly distorted mirror, but a mirror nonetheless.
I want to end with a thought that brings us back to that Sleepwalker quote. The source says, "He will go down in history as the most worshipped and the most despised man the world has ever known."
A prophecy that certainly came true.
But just think about that idea of the sleepwalker. If a leader genuinely believes they are being guided by an infallible inner voice, rather than by logic or facts or the council of experts.
And if the public reinforces that belief by cheering every irrational step,
then the sleepwalker just keeps walking, doesn't he?
He does.
And the question is, at what point does that sleepwalker lead everyone, the whole country, right off a cliff? And maybe more importantly, why didn't anyone try to wake him up?
Because they were sleepwalking right along with him.